All right. Greetings and salutations, everybody. Happy Monday, assuming you're in here with me live. If you're watching this or listening to this later, then happy whatever day it happens to be. I need to figure out a good way to make some kind of messaging that applies to people now and also applies to people later, which probably makes it silly, but there you go. I had grand plans over the weekend to do a bunch of stuff, and I didn't. Actually, I did do a bunch of stuff, but not in the computer realm. I found that by the time I got to Saturday, I was ready to kind of unplug, get away from the computer at least, which meant that I let some stuff sit and breathe in my brain a little bit, let those creative juices swell until I was getting headaches from all the wonderful ideas that I had, or maybe not so wonderful ideas that I had. We shall see about that. One of these said ideas, which is what I thought I would kind of switch gears a little bit and see what we get, where it takes us. And I made a very, very, very simple PowerPoint setup. I'm not someone who really uses PowerPoint much. Certainly, it's not something I've had to do as part of my day job anywhere around the way very much. So you can see I have no amazing hex press templates to lean on, or if you're watching it, no particular wonderful templates. Maybe I'll have to create some to make it a little bit more colorful. Hopefully this will get the sense of it right. And actually, I said deconstruct spells. It's really I'm really talking about deconstructing magic, but I changed titles after I made this slide. I never went back and corrected it, but that is okay. And the idea here, in broad strokes, the high level abstract of this would be when you're reading spells, right? And here I meant to get my BX book and I don't have it, so I happen to have Lamentations right here. Reading spells, right? And talking about magic in different rule systems, such as Lamentations. These spells imply things about their setting. And to use an example from Lamentations, probably the one really famous spell in here, right? The summon spell. You can get it right at level 1. Extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily random. Get all kinds of wonderful, weird stuff. In one of my other videos where I went over my game recaps, you could see where I pulled something from a summon spell and used it as a random encounter. And, that you just get these really crazy, amazing things. I think you can even literally break your setting via the summon spell if a player character is extremely lucky or unlucky, depending on how you want to figure it. But with that spell in your game, it says things about your game. It says things about your system. Clearly, in the Lamentations setting, it is saying something about their implied setting that A, the spell is out there, at B, it's out there at very low levels, C, the kinds of stuff that you're getting out of it, right? And sort of the risks, reward inherent about it, because it's not something that you summon it and it's automatically under your control. There's a whole tug of war aspect where you have to put your will against the will of this creature, and potentially you can win that contest and then exert some control over it. I think there is an outcome where it exerts control over you, and then some outcome where you're just unsuccessful and the thing is just running around. So there's a lot there to unpack in terms of, well, what does that say about your game? What is it saying about the nature of the universe if this is out there? But I don't think we often think about that too much in terms of our home games. We find a system that we like. Maybe we pick the system somewhat in terms of what the magic is like. But I think it's something we can maybe spend a little bit of time on. And in an OSR sense, there's not that many spells and the magic's not so complicated that I think it's beyond the realm of what we could do, especially for a campaign level, what we could do to prep or get ready for a campaign, to think about what spells are we using and how's magic going to work, and how is that magic reflected in the see here, right? How is magic reflected in the materials that players are going to have, in how we're going to be telling these characters magic works. So the kind of questions I'm thinking to keep in mind is, what is a particular spell? And one of the things I want to get into too is not just individual spells, but schools of magic. And I'm just going to pull a couple out. So I'm not going to go through every school, and I'm not meaning here to go through every spell either. I've picked out a couple, and actually I've left the kind of bullet points in there blanks. I think that's where I'm hoping we can have some conversation and talk things out, and maybe come up with some interesting stuff. And I may have to pull out of this view so I can actually type in some of these bullet points. But like I said before, right, questions we want to keep in mind. What is a spell, or what does the magic say about our world? What assumptions does it suggest? And then what can we do if we want to alter these assumptions? Because maybe assumptions in our world are not like they are in either the explicit or implied setting of the rules. Now, Lamentations, just in the core book, it doesn't have much of an implied setting. It's pretty generic as far as things go. But like I said, that summon spell actually does powerful work in setting up somewhat of an implied setting of the danger and just the kind of how you're opening yourself up to the void when you summon things. Whereas a very clean, easy to use, limited summon and elemental says something very orderly about the world. So something the world that you can exert the kind of control. Whereas Lamentations is saying maybe at the best of times, it's a roll of the dice. You're opening yourself up to stuff from the universe coming in, and that stuff is weird, crazy, cruel, world breaking potentially, and certainly not something that is easy to control. And you can't count on it. Just because you controlled it once doesn't mean you get it back and you control it again. So let's see. I'm on my PowerPoint foo. It's terrible. And again, these slides, I apologize. They're super generic and basic, but I just wanted to kind of get the bullet points out there so that we can take them as jumping off points. All right, Elfbait in the chat. Hey, Elfbait says they love dangerous magic. Absolutely. And nothing says about summon, and the fact that someone's first level means large number of people can and will be casting it. Right. So it's saying both that it's somewhat easy to get this entree into just the whatever the craze, the sort of lunacy of the multiverse that's just beyond our comprehension. It's easy to do and dangerous, right? Which might explain why there may be many low-level wizards, but not that many high-level ones, because probably more than a few wizards became victims of their own summon spells. In fact, when I was running a game in Lamentations, the wizard that was playing in my group would cast summon as a very last resort and would basically cast a spell and run away. Just hoping that whatever it was, whether it was hostile or controlled, that they would have a good buffer of distance between it and them. And then it could just kind of do its thing, and hopefully they'd be they'd have that head start on it if it turned bad. Right now, it's just kind of the spell it was. So I'm going to talk about two things here, and I always get confused with some of the names of the schools. So here I brought up two of, I guess, the kind of default generic schools of magic. Oh, wait a minute. Let me hit Elfbait up. Elfbait's got another comment first. Suppose if you look at it like Shaman 101 calling on spirits and other beings, kind of goes with the various indigenous magic systems. Yes. Though I would say it with and again, I don't know much about kind of shamanic style summoning, but I feel like in the sense of someone trying to summon or channel a specific spirit, they're summoning or channeling a specific spirit. With the summon spell, you have no idea what you're going to get. This is not, I'm calling for a particular spirit, say the spirit of a raven, and the raven spirit comes and we interrupted it from dinner, and so it's mad at us, right? This is something like I might hope to summon a raven spirit, but instead I'm getting something with 8 limbs, massive amounts of teeth, hyper intelligent, and just wants human blood, right? So there's a sense that you were just reaching out for something, anything. In fact, I think via that spell, I think it really is impossible. I think the only thing you can really set as the wizard is essentially how powerful the creature might be, but you can get something. And if you look back at the creature I summoned, which is in the if you go to the community tab on my YouTube channel, you can see I posted a screenshot of what I summoned. It was only a 2 HD creature, but since it was a pure energy demon, It was a 2 HD creature that couldn't be harmed by normal weapons. So even though it's 2 HD, it would have been if my party had tried to fight the thing very much, it would have been a super deadly fight. But getting back to schools of magic, so I picked 2. And again, I apologize. I know Necromancy is Necromancy. I can't remember. I always get confused over which one is which. I picked Conjuration was the other one. And the reason why I picked these is because, and we can talk about all the different schools of magic. But I think Necromancy is one that tends to be have a very great effect or reflection of the setting. And this happens, you see it in 5th edition all the time. Is Necromancy evil? Why is Necromancy evil? If my Necromancer thinks they're doing it for good reasons, is it still evil? Right? All these different things. Well, a lot of that comes to the fact that in terms of the setting, everyone has different definitions of what necromancy means. And maybe I should back up in a minute, but I'll just finish this thought. What necromancy means, not in terms of, well, you're dealing with dead bodies, but no, like literally, like, what are you doing? And so let me go back a step. So before we get to schools of magic, we should probably just think about magic in and of itself. And I should have put a slide in here and I forgot. What is magic? I'm going to use an example in Star Wars. We went from, magic, the Force, it's this thing, it pervades all of us. Okay, great. And then you get to, the Phantom Menace, and they say magic is, the Force is conducted through midichlorians, right? Which part of the problem that, as fans of the old movies, then coming to these prequels, was that kind of changes the whole nature of it. If you're saying that magic comes from these midichlorian type little creatures, then why don't folks just go around injecting themselves with midichlorians? And maybe they do, right? It's defining the Force in that way has implications for the setting. And when you're doing it kind of midstream, where you start off people thinking it's kind of metaphysical, ever present, to no, maybe it is that, but it's really because it's channeled by, I don't know, some kind of a bacteria type thing. It has a real effect. In the same way, we tend to think of magic, well, it's just this kind of pervasive force over everything. But it might be worth thinking about, well, is it separate from everything? Is it connected to something? Is magic just another element? We have fire, water, earth, air. Is magic that? Is it more akin to the fabric of the universe? So you might think of, we've got, space, time, magic, in a fantasy world. Is that how it's threaded together? Maybe in settings that have ley lines and things of that nature, where magic is more powerful in certain areas than others, not because of the presence of a particular wizard, but because the earth itself, the land itself is emanating more magic. Is that what it's being drawn from? So what does it say about places that are deep in the earth? Or what does it say about places that are high in the sky? If the ley lines, as far as magical energy, is radiating out from, say, sea level for whatever reason, then maybe going up or maybe going down, it gets more concentrated, maybe going up, it gets less concentrated. Or is it a property of every rock and living thing, kind of like the biosphere of the plane? Is that where magic comes from? So you think, well, who cares? We're all talking about pervasive forces. Well, sure, but then what does an anti-magic shell look like if the magic comes from a pervasive, just floating around force, versus whether it comes from some kind of living energy, kind of biosphere type thing, or whether it comes from being connected to the material of a plane, right? A spell like that should look and behave differently, or look and have different characteristics, or just how it appears will be different depending on what your magic looks like. And it's something to think about, because we all have, I think, for our settings in general, we all have these ideas of what magic is like in our games, but a lot of times we don't connect it back to, well, if this is what magic looks like in our games, then how does that affect the spells that our magic users are casting? What if magic really is because you're connected to a plane? Because presumably if we're playing a game with multiple planes, if we're presuming that magic exists across all the planes, then maybe we say, okay, it's part of that planar fabric. So if you're making an anti-magic shell, does that mean we are somehow cutting off this area or this person, this object? It's sort of detached from the fabric of the planes. And what does that mean? right? And even if we want to say that on a technical level, it doesn't mean anything, but when we're describing it, even if the players don't know what that shell looks like, then it gives us some really interesting hook for talking about what is visibly, or on whatever site or detection model you can use to detect it. What does it look like? What does it do? Nothing in the chat says, tell people living in Dark Sun, who cares where magic comes from? Yes. Well, and again, different settings, right? Get into it. But I'm talking more about applying it to our own setting. Because yes, we imagine that in sort of book settings, they will lay out somewhat what it looks like. They're not entirely, and I guess it would depend, right? The Dark Setting was an entire, obviously a setting, book and set, and I think it was supported by its own versions of magic. But when we're playing our home games, we don't often think about all that supporting material. So whereas we can say, sure, Dark Sun had it, and I would probably say that most of the sort of big box settings would address it. I don't think we tend to do it in our home games, or we address part of it. Maybe we just, well, look, magic comes from here, but then we're handing out the same spells that we would even if we're playing Forgotten Realms. And then is there a bit of a disconnect, or even if there's not a disconnect, even if we just kind of hand wave it because we understand that we're using some version of D&D or OSR game that essentially has the generic magic system attached to it with the basically generic magic spells in there, is that a lost opportunity for us as creators, as world builders, to go beyond just the generic things and think about, well, what are the implications for a setting? If I have a very specific setting idea of magic, then maybe it's worth going through these spells, going through these schools of magic, if we're using a schools of magic system, going through here and thinking about how does my setting impact these things, which then impacts the spells. And then that in itself, not only is it world building, but it's kind of a sneaky way of giving that to your players, because your players are generally going to see these spell lists. They're going to read through them. If they're picking a wizard, they're going to become familiar with them. And it's kind of like you're able to sneak in these little bits of world building that you don't have to spend exposition in laying out, because your magic user is going to see it. And in your setting, maybe only a magic user would even be aware of these things, but they're going to get that little extra world building that once you've done, it's kind of, it's that work that you're going to do once, basically at the beginning of your campaign. And if you play multiple campaigns in the same setting, it may be work that you do once for multiple campaigns. And it might have that payoff with your characters where you're able to kind of slide in some extra knowledge about your world that they're going to ingest almost without knowing, because they're going to pick up on that implied setting. So I want to go back to schools of magic. So I mentioned two here in my bare bones PowerPoint slide, one of which is Conjuration, the other one is Necromancy. In the kind of magic that I don't know appeals to me, I'm not going to say it appeals to everyone, it appeals to me. The idea of magic users being able to create things out of thin air, I feel like that's like the strongest kind of magic there is. Any kind of magic that says you can create anything, even something small, basically out of nothing, is immensely powerful, because that is the stuff of the gods. That is, and maybe not even the gods, but the elder gods, or the being of creation that even preceded the gods. That act of creation is about the most powerful, if you want to call it divine, thing that could possibly be done. So I'm not a big fan of handing that stuff out to wizards at basically any level, except for maybe the highest level, but maybe then I would even say, no, you're not doing it. So what does that mean in my kind of game? Spells that would be of that type. Conjuration. Now I could just remove them. Be one option. Yeah, there's no conjuration school. Those spells that you're essentially conjuring things, or at least the ones that where it's clearly that you're making something, as opposed to, and I don't even know if the school of, I think there's a 5th edition spell, and it might be earlier, was it like conjure forest creatures, something like that? I don't know that you're really conjuring them as far as you're pulling them from either from the surroundings, or they're potentially like some kind of planar spirits that take the form of animals, right? Those kind of things get around it, which would be maybe my conclusions. Maybe I don't want to get rid of conjuration entirely, but I'm going to change the flavor of it and potentially the mechanic of it to suggest that, no, you're not actually creating something. You are potentially manipulating things, right? So to put in another example, let's say we take an alchemical property, right? You take lead and you want to turn lead into gold. Are you really creating gold out of lead? No, maybe you're manipulating, you're taking lead and you're manipulating it on some level. We want to look at it scientifically, right? We're adding the extra, was it neutron or proton? I don't know on the periodic table, whatever, I forget, whatever it is that separates lead from gold. And we could even suggest in the components something that would suggest that, yeah, you have lead and you are using this other element that you have, and then you are putting those together, and through the spell, you are taking that lead and turning it into gold. And even though a lay person might look at that spell and say, wow, you've turned lead into gold, you know that really what you've done is just manipulated the underlying matrix of materials to make lead into gold. You have not created something out of something it really was not. Elfbait says that reskinning is the DM's best friend. Yes, and part of this is definitely reskinning, right? Where I may not be really changing the spell much at all. I might just be changing the way it looks, but it could get deeper than that. I think someone mentioned, I never really noticed it before in Lamentations, but there aren't a lot of all of the there's just purely offensive magic user spells are gone. So you can't, there's very few just blow things up spells. I see that magic missile's still there. I'm trying to see, is fireball there on 3rd level? Nope, there's no fireball. There is explosive runes. All right, but that idea of which spells exist and what forms they take because of what your setting is like. Nothing getting in here says, changing spells to reinforce your world works. In my world, the source of magic, mage magic, is evil, but the players didn't take that idea seriously until I changed a lot of spells to make them feel evil. Right. And that's kind of what I was speaking to before. You could tell them, well, magic comes from evil. No, okay. But then someone says, well, I'm going to play a wizard. And you hand them, well, here are the wizard spells you could possibly have. And they all are working off of clearly, the fluff is clearly focused towards this stuff is evil. Then that starts to put in their mind, whoa, magic is really evil. And maybe if you didn't even tell them magic was evil, I would bet that if you said nothing about how magic works in your world and one of them decided to become a magic user and you handed it to them, probably their next question is going to be to you is magic good in this world? Can I be a good magic user? Because I'm reading a lot of this stuff and it sounds bad. So it's a way you can communicate without outwardly communicating, which is kind of the when we talk about implied settings and rules, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the rules are written out, but they usually just have to imply some sort of setting about them. They have to make choices, and those choices, if you put them all together and write them all down, will be basically the bones of a setting. So you can kind of do some little bit of world building by taking whatever implied setting that magic may have in this example and making sure that it implies your setting as opposed to implying the setting that from the rules that you're using. So I look at Conjuration. I say, if there's any of these Conjuration type spells that are clearly creating something from nothing, and let me see if I can find one here from Lamentations has any. I know they have them on the let's see, on the cleric side. Is there anything? I'm not seeing. I was looking for. So, for example, create food and water type spells, right? So I wouldn't have them in my game. You can't simply take nothing and create food and water. Now, could you take water that's gross and purify it? Yes. Could you maybe even take mud and turn it into something else? Maybe. Right. The idea of manipulating material from one type to another, maybe, but you can't just put an empty plate, wave your hand over it, and suddenly there are delicious chocolates. That's extremely hard to do. Even if the effect you're trying to make is very simple and almost, as far as seriousness, no more than a cantrip, you can't do it, right? That's really tough. So what I would want to do is, if this was the kind of magic I had where I'm like, Conjuration is the hardest thing, is the most divine of all magics, it's the stuff that only gods can do, then I would have to go through and figure out how can I rewrite these spells if I want to keep them, to make them less about conjuring and more about some other manipulation, or I'm going to move them out. So now we come to Necromancy, and I'm going to pull out Lord of the Rings yet again, because I've been listening to that podcast and going through it. And I mentioned this example before. Tolkien's idea of what and I don't know if he invented the concept of a barrow wight or not, but his conception of the barrow wights was not that there was a spirit of a dead person who, for whatever reason, couldn't leave the world and so was roaming around or was trapped in a barrow waiting to be discovered. The barrow wights had nothing to do with the creatures that were buried in the tombs. What they were was you have a body potentially in a tomb, and the Witch King of Angmar sent evil spirits in, and those evil spirits came from Mordor and inhabited, or the East, I'm assuming Mordor, inhabit those bodies, and that is the barrow wight. Right. Barrow wight. Okay. If we look at necromancy and we say, in my game, if you are raising up undead, you are not simply, or maybe we should look at it this way. You are taking in some kind of animating force and you are putting it in a body to animate it. So you have a dead corpse, you're going to say some magic words, it's going to animate. We ask ourselves the question, maybe, what is animating this corpse? In something like Lord of the Rings, what is animating it is an evil spirit that is, I'm not sure where the spirit comes from, but it's somehow unbound or it's available to be pushed into something, right? It's free roaming. It's a free roaming vapor, perhaps, to use the Ghostbusters terminology. So you have this free roaming vapor, and you were able to pull that free roaming vapor and say, here, now you're going to roam in this corpse. If that's what necromancy is, before we get into specific spells, but if that is literally what necromancy is, the manipulation of evil spirits to animate the dead, then there's no question whether necromancy is good or evil. That answers the question. The answer is it's evil. You're taking evil spirits and you're putting them into bodies to animate them. That's evil. I don't think there's, I don't know how I can come up with an argument that if what I am doing to animate, to make a zombie or to make a skeleton is to call out to some evil spirit from somewhere, maybe from another plane, maybe from somewhere, an unsettled evil spirit. But if that is what necromancy is, taking evil spirits and putting them in undead bodies and then commanding them to go do stuff, you can no longer make the argument that it's good. That D&D 5th edition, and I don't even know if they ever did, never really define that. That's what leaves that question open. And that's where you leave some GMs looking at it as clearly taking that same tack as you're raising the dead with some kind of like negative energy or spirit that's plainly evil, as opposed to somebody else saying, why? It's just a body and I'm just putting kind of an animating spirit in. Well, that's because we haven't really addressed the question of what is the animating force. Is it just air, or is it just some kind of neutral spirit thing out there, or does it come from somewhere? In Tolkien's world, it came from an evil spirit. So therefore, if you're going to be manipulating those and using them, that's evil. Let's see. Oh, no, I'm just pulling up Nothing's old comment. I thought maybe it was something new. So we already covered that one. So what do our schools of magic say about our settings? And if we're looking at it and we want to make a point of what necromancy is like, because maybe in my setting, I'm going to say necromancy is evil, but I want to tempt the players to use it. So maybe I want to have necromancy as something that's available, but as I'm writing it up, it's going to be clear that necromantic spells involve calling upon evil spirits. I could also look at what kind of, the things that were jokes in the old editions. I didn't forget some of them, like gust of wind. Like it was like, I don't know, you had to it was like beans was one of the things you had, one of the materials you had to use, right? Because it's joking about farting. But we can take those more seriously. We can look at, okay, you're going to have, even if we're not going to use them in our game, if we're going to hand wave our material components, we can have some fun, but in a useful way of saying with necromancy, what could we think about for what might we use as a material that can, even if it's only in the fiction, if we want to say it's confined to the fluff, well, what kind of fluff is going to really reinforce this idea that necromancy is evil as opposed to just vague or potentially neutral? Elfbait says 5e specifically still calls necromancy evil. They do have the evil energies angle in there. Okay, good. I kind of thought it did, but I think maybe it's because they talk about, as evil energies as opposed to something more specific. Maybe that gives some people that wiggle room, or maybe people are so far divorced from the default fluff or even mechanics in some ways that they just consider it not bad, right? But 5th edition and Dungeons & Dragons in particular, and I'm sure this is true for Pathfinder and any of the really giant systems, they're trying to appeal to such a broad scope of people. They're going to make choices based upon that. Whereas for our home games, we can be much more specific. We can say, guess what? Necromancy is taking evil spirits, putting them in the bodies, and animating them. I don't have to worry about, but maybe part of my player base likes necromancers, or maybe part of my player base does this, or maybe that. I don't care. This is my home game, and my player base is 4 to 5, 6 people, maybe. And even if I want to say it, I'm running an open table game. My player base is still going to be 10, 20 people, even if I'm super popular. How many could there be? 50? I mean, the kind of things that they have to they want to address and they want to do for their game do not have to be the things at all that we're trying to do. So we don't need to we can be as specific as we want to be, right? Elfbait also says, I did create a good quote unquote necromancer that worked with the dead instead of forcing them around, asked the dead to come back to their bodies to help the living. Right. And that's another thing. We could have that aspect too. If we want to say that necromancers are trying to pull back the original spirits, calling out to them, come back, we need you, help us, right? That's a whole other twist on it. And theoretically, maybe they could have one school that encompasses both of those. Just some of the spells are the kind of the evil side of the coin, and some of the spells are the good side of the coin. But that says something about our setting, right? It says something if we are saying that these good spirits can come back and want to come back, and also kind of how we're talking to them, right? Which I think is something else I want to touch on with some of these spells, and I'm going to get into a minute. I guess I'll just move on to the next slide, moving from schools of spells to particular spells, is what are the mechanisms that are making these spells work? Like, let's just not take it as read, and here's the one I brought up, first one, detect magic. What does it mean? And I don't mean like, what does detect magic mean? It means you're going to cast a spell and you're going to see or feel some trace of magic in the room. I get that, but what does it mean? Like, what are we cast detect magic? Is it that we're casting out magic like radar, and magic pings against magic and comes back to us, and that's how we see it? Is there some sort of other like a magic plane almost that like where our eyesight changes and we see now into the magic plane, so that magic stuff's going to light up and normal stuff, kind of like if you think of the concept of when Frodo puts on the ring in the movies, or I think it's described somewhat similar in the books, as the stuff that's in the material world sort of gets very just blotchy and indistinct, but the ring rates and other things that operate on that plane are all, you finally see them in kind of their glory. Is that what detect magic is, right? What does it mean? Something I've been thinking about in my game is, and again, because I've been reading and listening to all this Tolkien stuff, is thinking about it is, does magic resonate on, say, an ethereal plane, right? A plane that's, it's exact same as the material plane, but it's where all the kind of spirits and potentially magic things where they really resonate. So something that is, it looks like a bowl. Well, if you cast detect magic, maybe what you're really doing is you are able to see, you're not able to really interact with stuff on the ethereal plane if it only exists on the ethereal plane, but you're able for that minute or whatever to see onto the ethereal plane. And on the ethereal plane, you could see all the glimmer, like the magic, the material part of the item becomes indistinct, but all the magic stuff becomes crystal clear. Maybe that's what detect magic looks like. In which case, if I were to do this in my game, then maybe I wouldn't have detect magic at all. What I would have is something that's like see ethereal, right? Ethereal vision, sight ethereal, something I'd try to come up with. I kind of like see ethereal. Maybe that's a good word, which encompasses both, could encompass a bunch of different effects in one spell. maybe it lets you detect magic because you can see stuff that's magic. Maybe there are other things that would appear, which I'll get to later, that might also appear on the ethereal plane that don't appear in the physical plane for one reason or another. It doesn't let you interact with them. If there's a ghost that's riding around the ethereal plane, you'll be able to see it, but that won't help you hit it, but you'll be able to know it's there. Maybe that's how it works. But thinking about how it works, it's world building. It's also how we can describe things to our players. It's how different things in my world will interact. So if you are a ghost or you're a spirit, you might inherently see magic things. And if somebody says, like, why is the ghost attacking me as opposed to attacking them? Maybe it's because you're wearing +1 plate mail. And maybe it makes magic items really interesting in that way because they attract stuff that's on the ethereal plane because they're highly visible in the ethereal plane. They are shining out in a way that someone just walking around in a bunch of leathers or even a non-magic suit of plate mail just looks like a blobby blur. You in standing with your +2 helm and your +3 plate mail and your Vorpal sword, you are shining out to them like, a Christmas tree, and it just draws them to you, which is a really interesting thing. But I didn't get to that concept by itself. I got to it by thinking about, what is magic generally, and then what are the interactions between these things? Why does the spell work the way it does? What does the spell really indicate? What are you really doing when you cast the spell? Let's see. Nothing says, is magic a type of physical radiation you can see with a detection spell? Right. But then what is the detection spell doing? Right. What is the detection spell doing to the magic user so that they can see the radiation? Is it like a sense? Are you communing with a spirit? You could easily rewrite detect magic and wipe out all my other ideas. And you could say instead, and this kind of works with the necromancy we were doing before, if there are spirits of indeterminate age and power and knowledge that are resting in their glory, maybe detect magic is calling out to one of those guys saying, hey, buddy, you've been around the block a few thousand times. What is that bowl? And that guy looks at it and says, all right, let me tell you about that bowl because I can tell you exactly. I know who made it. I played Pinochle with them last week. That bowl is, or that, I guess that'd be more identified, but I could tell you that bowl is magic, right? I can see it even though you can't. That bowl is definitely magic. That says something about the world, right? So you can come up with all these different ways to do it, and then going back to say like an anti-magic shell kind of thing. If what you're doing for these different kinds of spells is reaching out to spirits and having them connect with you, then an anti-magic shell would then cut you off from those spirits, which would be different than if spirits were maybe separate completely from magic. Then a spirit could pass through an anti-magic shell, because technically you could say, well, the spirit's not magic, but maybe the spirits and magic are intertwined. Therefore, you couldn't have a ghost, let's say, inside an anti-magic shell, or you could, but you have to think about decisions so you can make them, right? Elfbait says, ghosts attracted to magical things like sharks on magnetic things? Could be, absolutely. That is definitely one really interesting way to do it, which might, dissuade folks from carrying around every single magic item they ever have on their person. And you can tie that into all kinds of things, right? What do dragons naturally see on both the ethereal and physical planes, which is why they're able to gather these hordes of all kinds of interesting items. It's not just by chance. It's not just that they have, you could give them detect magic to spell, sure, but maybe they just naturally see it. It's just part of dragon vision. So of course they're going there when they're looking at places to go and sack and things to take. They are naturally, maybe they smell it. Maybe it's something in there. They smell ethereal, right? You could think about all these different ways to pull it in there versus it's just a spell. Right, which is, you think about it, it's kind of boring. Yeah, it's a spell. Okay, it's a spell, but digging a little deeper. Why is a spell? What is this spell actually doing, and how can we work in what it's actually doing with the kind of world that we want to create? And we come to identify, right? So I put these next to each other because I do think they're very similar. So I said before, what is it that you're doing when you identify? And I know, yes, you're casting a magical spell to tell you things about an item. But how is that working? How does it work? What is the magic doing? Is it like I mentioned before? Are you contacting a spirit and the spirit comes back and says, yeah, I know that. He's my boy. We're hanging out on the ninth level of Pandemonium. And he made that when he was about in his mid-30s. He was feeling a little bit angsty. He was kind of, he was away from his home and he missed his mom and dad. So this is what he kind of did to it. This is how it works. Is that what's happening? Is there some kind of a pattern in the material and you're able to read it, right? Is it kind of flicking on your vision and you're seeing some sort of pattern that tells you, that you read, that tells you what it is? Is it something else? Like how is identify actually working? Yes, we know it's a spell, but if you think about something like levitate, what does the spell do? Well, levitate makes you, for a limited period of time, lighter than air, so you begin to float. So, okay, that makes sense, right? For identify, we don't think about, well, what is identify really doing? Well, we usually tend to think about, well, it gives you this information, which for meta reasons is nice because it allows you to figure out which things might be useful, which things might not be useful, and blah blah blah, right? But how does it work? And then we can then have a lot of fun with how that works in terms of when it's deployed in the game, the kind of effects that it's doing. And then also we can try to think about, well, how does this stuff work in our world? How do we want it to work? And imprint that in the spell and imprint that in the magic. Hey, see Simpson 14. Dragons can see ethereal like snakes with sensory pits, can see infrared. Yeah, maybe, right? Absolutely. And then there's some really interesting things if they can see both of those. If they are, and we could think about, do really powerful creatures exist on both planes at once? There's something that a dragon looks the same, whether you're seeing them on the physical plane or the ethereal plane. And it would be really neat if we were to take this ethereal piece out and say, okay, magic, whatever it is, operates on the ethereal plane as far as whatever effects you see manifest physically, it manifests its natural, maybe its most natural manifestation, whether it's active or not, is on the ethereal plane. There's that moment in the Justice League, the Zack Snyder Justice League. I didn't love the movie, but there's that bit where the Flash is running really fast doing something. That part of the movie, spoilers, when Superman has been woken up, but he's not in a nice, positive state of mind. And the Flash is zipping around like, I think he's a little bit, I don't know, cocky is the word, but he seems kind of self-assured. Like, I'm the Flash, I'm running super, I'm in the speed zone or whatever, the speed force zone. And there's that bit where everything is slowed down and he's trucking along and he looks at Superman and all of a sudden he sees Superman's eyes look and see him. I mean, there could be a really fun moment if a wizard decided to go, I'm going to go into ethereal mode and I'm going to go flying and check out that dragon's lair. Sure that I can at least sneak in and take a peek and they won't see me because I'll be in the ethereal plane. And then the dragon kind of looks and just locks eyes on the wizard. Yeah, kind of thing. So we got some more from Nothing saying, again, in my world, magic items have synthetic souls and identifies a charm spell that convinces the item to tell the wizard what it does. See, I like that very much. It's got a really great flavor to it, and I'm super interested now in what a synthetic soul is. But I think that's very cool. And yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? We can use these spells to really say things about our world and communicate them to our players in a way that's kind of organic. Fluffy the Griffin says, I leave identify out of my games, never care for how it undoes the mystery of enchanted items. That's certainly valid as well. Absolutely. It's a choice we make, and we can, and it's worth thinking about that. Granted, you're talking about it on a meta level. I don't like the spell because it does these things on a meta level I don't like, but it might be worth thinking about what other reasons could there be fictionally why it doesn't work. Right? What limits does it? Are we speaking to a limit of magic itself? The magic simply can't see into these natures. It could be interesting. It might lead you to other ideas about your world. Going down these paths of thinking about things might lead you to interesting ideas. I'm really kind of digging this stuff about the ethereal plane. I'm really digging this idea of items being infused with synthetic souls. I don't know where these ideas will take me, but the reason I got to them, or obviously one was gifted to by None Nothing, but the other one, it's by going through this chain of starting to think about how does a spell work, try to kind of walk through how it works, and then it opens up all kinds of possibilities. Not only have I done some world building for potentially my players, I've done some world building for myself. Now maybe I'm thinking about, well, maybe the ethereal plane has a really interesting aspect to it, a very powerful aspect to it that I really hadn't thought of before. C. Simpson says, "Got to go, or am I going to upload this?" I am going to upload this. Everything is going to be on Facebook. They don't disappear. So you will be able to find this after the fact on streams, and I also back it up to Odyssey. Everything here will go to Odyssey as kind of a YouTube backup. So there's there as well. But yeah, this will be on the channel. So thanks for joining, C. Simpson, and check out the rest of the replay. Fluff the Griffin says, "Yeah, I used to rule that Identify can only detect the intended enchantments, but couldn't see darker corruption or curses on the item." And I think that's standard too, right? But it's an interesting aspect to think about fictionally. So I think in 5th edition, Identify will not identify curses, but we can think about why. And there's the meta reasons. Well, we don't want curses to be so easily found out. We want people to experiment by trying things on and find out curses that way and to figure out to get it off. Okay, that's great. But then, no, but in the fiction, why? Like if we are using, if we have a synthetic soul in the item and we convince the synthetic soul to tell us if it's cursed, are we saying that the synthetic soul won't tell us because it's corrupted, but corrupted in a way that we can't tell? Might we give them a role? Might we say with this Identify spell, okay, well, if you're talking to a corrupted synthetic soul inside this item, maybe you can detect if it's corrupted or not. Maybe you have to cast it at a higher level to do that. Maybe then we take Identify and say it's just a higher level spell because the concept now is a lot more complicated. It's not just something, now you're interfacing with these synthetic souls. Maybe it's just a more powerful spell because of what it's giving you. And I think we should always feel free to change the levels of the spells. Like if we think that, well, we just don't want them to have it, that's fine. We could also say, well, I don't want them to have it at whatever level Identify comes in on. First, second level? I don't even know. Let me see what does Lamentations have? Identify. They have Identify at first level, right? So maybe we say, it's not because of all it's giving you, we don't want to give it to you at first level. That's way too early. But maybe we could say third level. Third level maybe is more appropriate. If I'm going to decide that there's a mechanism by which you can see cursed items, then maybe I say, third level's more appropriate for that. None Nothing says, cursed items have the ability to deceive. Normal items always tell the truth. But this, None Nothing talking about in his world. But this implies, though, that you can potentially catch the deception. So it implies that there's a mechanism for deceiving or for seeing the deception, right? That they're not omnipotent or all powerful in deception. I mean, that at least seems to me to imply that. So we would want to come up with what's the mechanism. Maybe I would say, okay, if Identify is a first level spell, at first level, it's only going to tell you it's true. It's just going to assume everything is true, or you don't get enough back. You don't get enough back from Identify to determine whether it's true. Maybe I'll say I kind of like the idea of upcasting spells like they do in 5th edition. You have first level Identify, but if you cast it as a third level spell, maybe you get more out of it. Maybe you got to cast it like using 2 slots instead of 1 slot, and that 2 slots will give you an idea of the deception. Maybe you can cast it with 3, and that will just flat out tell you. So if 1 is you're going to take everything as the truth, and you're not going to have enough information. 2 is maybe it gives you a roll, and sometimes you'll get the deception, sometimes you won't. Then maybe you use 3, and you're getting the full truth. You'll know what's true and what's deceptive. So you play with the risk rewards, which I love, and it also gives you a chance if you want to mitigate things, you can spend the extra spell slots, but then of course you're spending spell slots you won't have later in the game, or it encourages you to do it at the end of the adventuring day when you think you're going to get your spell slots back. But of course, if you're resting and you get interrupted, you're up a creek, right? So what do you want to do? Okay, John Lennon in the house. Says the whole point about magic is that it works by magic. It only has to be relatively narratively consistent. Yes, but again, it's what is the magic doing, right? Because if I say the magic is contacting a spirit, I'm not trying to lay out how it does this. It contacts a spirit by magic, but it's still saying something about how it's working, about your world, by looking at the actual, not just looking at the end effect, but looking at how it's getting to the end effect. For example, I guess it's in The Hobbit, I think, and I might even be misremembering. Gandalf kind of makes not a true fireball, but he like causes like a big like blinding blast. And I want to say he doesn't create a fireball in the D&D sense. I want to say it's like a torch, and he just takes the torch and goes woof, right? He does kind of what Pyro from the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, if you ever followed the Marvel comics. He couldn't create flame, but he could manipulate flame that's already there. How is he manipulating the flame that's already there? It's just his mutant power. That's just magic is magic. But we're saying something about how this particular magic works on some level by indicating that no, you're not just creating fire out of nothing. You're creating fire from this existing source and you're manipulating it. So I don't think this is like, I don't think we're trying to tie down, get beyond magic is magic. But I think we can dig into the details a little bit before we get down to that bedrock of, well, it's magic. And just saying magic is magic doesn't do a whole lot for us as world builders, right? I think digging down and trying to see how this stuff works actually does, in a positive way, impact our world building. Let's see. Fluffy the Griffin says, magic in my game takes on a very fabric of the universe slant. Using magic is literally grabbing the ley lines of reality and tugging those strings. This can lead to all sorts of havoc. Absolutely, as well it should, right? If magic is, you're pulling on the very fabric of reality to do things, then the kind of stuff when you think about, well, what happens if the spell goes wrong, suddenly you're thinking about, whoa, the magnitude of what could go wrong or not right or sideways of this stuff really changes. John Lennon says detect and dispel magic should be level based. I wouldn't have a problem with that. I definitely think that in terms of what different creatures and effects and things are going on, that if dispel magic is level 1 and the 10th level wizard creates that effect, should the level 1 wizard just be able to come in and go dispel magic and get rid of it? Probably not. It seems in both, and it seems unfair if you're the player who's a 10th level wizard and you cast this crazy spell and the little hedge mage from the village just comes out and goes dispel magic and it's gone. That seems kind of cruddy. And it seems kind of cruddy the other way around. Whereas if you make it some kind of level based, like I guess Counterspell is in 5th edition, I think to some degree at least, that makes sense. And you could say the same thing for detect magic. Let's see. And then Fluffy the Griffin says, so detecting identifying magic would require revealing the manipulated ley lines and seeing how they're twisted and tied up. Going back to their system. Very cool, right? And that gives you a way as a GM of when you are describing this stuff, what it looks like. And you could even describe stuff that is corrupted magic at that point, where there are maybe tears in the fabric, maybe certain things, if you want to think about how the more, demons or devils or Cthulhuid, what is the word? I don't know, Cthulian. I know there's an adjective thing for it. I can't remember. Creatures get in the world is maybe because you're making tears with magic goes bad or super corrupted. It literally rips in, and then other planes can leak in. I've been watching that His Dark Materials, which is based on some books, and I finished the second season. And I guess, I don't know, kind of a spoiler, but they have a similar kind of effect where certain things leak into different areas because of people being Slushbub says Lovecraftian. Yeah, I guess Lovecraftian would be a good word for it. Or sort of leak in between, leak from one plane into another because of these kind of cracks and rips and gaps that are created. Fluffy the Grim says Cthulhu is one of the gods in my world, so it's a distinct possibility. Slushbubs also says Eldritch. That's another good word. I love Eldritch. I think I first heard it, I want to say old Doctor Strange. Eldritch magic of Doctor Strange. Woo! Yeah, I always like that word. A cool word in my book. All right, and I think I had, did I have one more spell to go through here? Oops, yep, that's my last one. Okay, so invisibility, right? What does it mean? Is magic literally impairing the sight? Is it Is it literally bending the sight of everyone around the individual? Is that how invisibility is working? I've just been thinking along the lines of the ethereal plane. Have you moved the person's physical part of their physicalness to the ethereal plane? So they no longer show up on the physical plane, but now they show up in the ethereal plane. So another interesting risk there. If that's what invisibility does, and I think here again, sort of the Tolkien One Ring kind of thing, kind of concept of, okay, for you put the ring on, you're invisible to things on the physical, but now all these spirits can see you. And if you're playing in a world that's got a lot of spirits or potentially very powerful spirits, then yeah, you've gone invisible from one set of potential antagonists to potentially visible to very visible to somebody else. So is that mean, how that change about how you want to use it? Is it more of a risk to use invisibility than just something you would put on at any opportunity? Oh, I go invisible. Well, now you might need to think a little bit more about that. If invisibility is just from this plane and potentially having almost a reversed effect on another plane, or is it working in the brains of the people in the area? Is it something where you've put an effect on somebody that it's almost sending out waves from the individual, that when brains, that when their eyes that detect the wave, it somehow just blanks you out of their brains as opposed to bending light? There's a ton of different ways to look at invisibility. And you could think about, again, going back to how magic works, which one of those is kind of the effect that makes the most sense. If your effects are spirit based, then potentially maybe you have spirits that are positioned around the character who are doing this kind of light bending. They're just, they're flanking them, and so they're just pushing the light out of the way. Just whoop, 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 whoop. Right? Maybe that's how it works. If we're talking about it being fabric of space and time, maybe you're kind of enveloping them, folding space around them so that they appear invisible. That could be another way to do it. But they all could have, if you think about it, have impacts on not only how you might describe to a wizard who is casting it. If you like the DCC idea of having spell effects from when they go wrong, if you want to think about, well, if that's what invisibility is kind of pulling up and like a cloaking yourself in the fabric of space. If you wanted to have a misfire table for invisibility, what does that look like? And you could have a lot of fun with that. If it is you're cloaking kind of space over itself, then you would be invisible to the ethereal plane, because I would assume that the ethereal plane is as subject to the fabric of space-time as the material plane. But if it's just them leaving, or their body, in a sense, becoming just moving into the ethereal space, in that case, they wouldn't. So there's a lot of implications there for how you want to play invisibility. And these are the stuff that I find really fun to think about. And I know it's stuff that we don't always have time to do. It's stuff that we don't always want to do. I mean, I don't know. This is the kind of stuff I always want to do, really. But I think in terms of, you don't have time, or it's not not that it's not important, but there's so many things. World building is such a huge undertaking that it can feel overwhelming, I think, in the best of circumstances. And I think that for those folks might see this and think like, oh gosh, what is he adding on top of my plate? Now I got to go through and vet all these different spells and things. And no, this is something that I think it adds to your world if you can. I think I always look at, kind of that gold standard for world building. Tolkien, he thought very deeply about these things, and it informed things, and it adds a depth to things when you can think about why things do the way they do. You don't necessarily lose much by not having it, but I think you can gain a lot through having it. And I also think when you get down to OSR, if you're dealing with your sort of regular spell list, it's not that many spells. If I were to go through here, I mean, it's okay. It's not a little bit of spells. Looking at, Lamentations again, just using magic user spells. I've got 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 130, 136. So it's not a lot. I'm not going to say that's not a lot of spells, but those 136 spells, it has them all together. But let's see, in total, and granted their pages aren't big, but let's see, it's 80. It's starting page is 89, and the spells run through. Okay, well, it's a quite a few spells. All right, it's a good bit of spells. But I think that if you start with, say, something like BX, this is what I'll say. If you're starting with something like BX, where it's only going to give you the first 3 levels of spells to begin with, start there. Just deal with those first 3 levels of spells. And then maybe a few other ones if you see them sort of working into your game through a scroll that's picked up, or because an enemy or independent NPC has them. But you can start small and work your way out, right? I guess what I would say there is if I wanted to do all this first level spells, because I'm starting at level 1 with magic users, that would mean that I'd have to go through and at least look over about 20 spells. And that's, I think, is doable, right? And I can worry about level 2 spells when they start to appear in the game. Or maybe I can work ahead and say, okay, I'll do level 1 and level 2. And then when they get to level 3, then I'll do level 3s and level 4. And then you just work your way through it. So I think you could sort of add this kind of thing to your I don't even know what word I want to say, your ongoing prep, as opposed to front loading it. As a side, I think a lot of people get caught up to what the work you have to do when you're creating a rule book is a lot of work. So you have to do it all up front because you have to publish the book. But for your home game, you don't have to. I don't have to worry about what my players are doing at level 8. They're level 2. At level 8, I'll worry, when they get to level 6, and I think they're going to get to level 8, then I'll start worrying about level 8. I just got to worry about 3rd level, 4th level, maybe, if I want to be looking ahead. Let's see. I got some messages in the chat here. Fluffy the Griffin says, that's neat. I also make it so undead don't see by normal beings, so invisibility has no effect on undead. They are attracted to positive energy. Right. That's great. I like that a lot. And it makes them more dangerous. And like I talked about with Daniel from Bandit's Keep, if you want to check out that video, if you missed that stream, I'm all for making undead more formidable in a way. So I like that very much. So yeah, they don't care. And you can, of course, apply that to other things, right? Maybe dragons see right through invisible as well if they see ethereal, right? Because if your invisibility is on the ethereal plane, because they would just look at you, see you. Nothing says Lindy Beige talked about some game where invisibility didn't stop people from seeing you. It stopped people from noticing you. So it's more of a mind effect spell. I have that ability. One of my player characters, has that same thing. And I actually specifically say that you have to get in it. You have to get in that invisibility when nothing's actively looking at you or sees you. So you have to kind of get up behind cover. Then you can put this effect on yourself. And then you're kind of cloaked. But if you make a lot of noise, if you're clearly moving through stuff, and how he got dinged is he was in that encounter with the crocodilian creatures that you may have heard me talk about. He was wading in the water, and they were creatures that were in tune with the water. So when he started wading in the water, that killed his invisibility type effect because they knew he was there. Even though if they had looked, they wouldn't have been able to see him. It just became too obvious for them to ignore. And part of his spell was kind of heightening that sense of something doesn't fit and you kind of ignore it. Bob Mosdell says, it's an area where there's not really anything objective to relate to. It's magic. Yes. Right. But I think it's when you decide to get to the it's magic part. You can just say it from jump. Identify. How does it work? It's magic. I mean, that's fine. But I think you can do more. We can get a little bit deeper in there. And I think it does. It's not just getting into semantics or something for the heck of it. I'm trying to, hopefully I have impressed that maybe there's some positive things you can glean out of thinking about for your setting. Not my setting, not Forgotten Realms, not Greyhawk, not Mystara. For your setting, what do these spells mean? Eventually you will get down to, well, how does it do this last step? It's magic, right? But it's how much do you want to think about what's happening before you get to its magic? You might want to think a little bit, you might want to think a lot. Let's see. Bob Mostel says it being vetting magic spells. Yep. Indeed. All right. Well, I think that's all I have on this one. I hope you guys dug this. I had kind of started this whole, I call it world shopping, sort of like work shopping, but world shopping. I was trying to do a little like a little word joke sort of thing in there, word association. And then I kind of dropped it. I have a lot of ideas. I get into them and I do a few of them and then I kind of get elsewhere and so it gets dropped. But I wanted to pick up that particular thread. And this occurred to me over the weekend. So I thought I would pull it up and workshop it with you guys for a spell. Well, that's all I've got. Hey, before you guys all bail out, give a thumbs up to the stream if you're in here. And if you're watching this video later, also give it a thumbs up if you found it useful. Elfbait says, good talk. Glad you appreciate it. If you happen to be in here and you didn't subscribe to the channel, please subscribe. You get notified when all these wonderful things come. It helps raise my profile in the algorithms of the tubes so that other folk will see this when they are surfing around. Slush Bub says, I never thought about how detect magic would actually work in practice. What you said earlier made me thinking about it a lot more. I'll probably look through spell lists and look at other spells too. Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you don't usually think about how they work. You just think about, oh, well, it detects the magic. Okay, well, how is it doing that? And I think they're very useful, even if you're only going to use them descriptively, because it's really just fun to kind of flesh out what your wizard is doing, which I think can make your wizard or magic using characters feel a lot more cool and wizardy or magic usery, when instead of it just being, well, you detect the magic, is like your eyes turn silver and people around you watching you seem to kind of glaze over as the world sort of fades away and everything that was in the world that everyone else can see has become a drab, blackish gray, but you see bright lights flaring up like flames or flickers of gold in the night and candlelight. And that's these things. Like, wow, that's a lot cooler. I mean, as a player, give me that description over you detect magic any day of the week. And, by having this stuff kind of thought about, you can be consistent with how you are referencing the future. So you don't end up referencing it 5 different ways from Sunday. And that consistency, I think, will help ground your players in the world. Now, this is a very good topic. There's a lot more to cover. Yes, I mean, we could go over it endlessly. Hopefully this is a taste. And of course, if there is aspects of this that you'd like to go into further, I just tried to pick out some spells that were kind of low-hanging fruit in some ways. They're also kind of core spells that everybody thinks about, and they're ones that also have more ambiguity in exactly what they're doing. But we could go through this exercise with a bunch of stuff, and I'd like to cover some other topics as well. But magic is really interesting, and it's one that more than other systems is kind of tied into the books we're using. So if I'm using Lamentations, like I said at the beginning, that has spells that work a certain way, and we don't often think about what the implications of that are or how we can change those implications. I can just hand somebody the Lamentations book and say, here are your spells, and just decide that whatever disconnect there is between what Lamentations setting is and mine is just, we'll just write it off. Or I can think about, well, maybe I can copy paste some of this out and go through it a little bit. And then when they're picking this stuff up, it'll be really consistent with my world. I can throw in some world building. It makes me think of how my world works. It will help the magic users figure out how things work. And it just adds to the whole depth and immersion of the setting. Fred Dennis says, appreciate your thoughtful content. Well, thanks. Thanks, guys. All right. Bob Muscle's getting twitchy. What is my shirt? All right, so this is off topic, but it's Whalers back in green. It's like if I stood up all the way, I would bounce out the top of the frame. It was so my cousin and his family, my uncle, and those guys are from Hartford, Connecticut. The home of the Hartford Whalers. And the Whalers moved away and became the Carolina Hurricanes. But through them, I always had an appreciation for the Whalers. And this was actually, I went to see a band. A friend of mine's in a band. And this was the opening act, were these guys. And I don't remember if they were called the Whalers, but they had these shirts, Whalers. And I was like, I had to get it. I had to get it to kind of celebrate. So I don't know, celebrate the old Hartford Whalers and just kind of have some fun with that. So I got the shirt. That's what the shirt is. All right, folks, I'm going to end this stream here. Like I said, if you like the stuff and you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. Press the bell. Do all that stuff. I should probably do this at the beginning because everyone starts to log off and then nobody hears his message. And it's kind of funny when you look at YouTube and it shows you how many people watch your videos. It's like, here's where it starts, and then it goes. So the amount of people who are going to see this at the very end of the stream, if they're watching it later, is basically nil. And also, if you're listening to this, if you listen to me in podcast mode, I would love some reviews. I don't have any. I need some. I know people download the podcasts. I think I passed 2,000 downloads in podcast form. I'm like in the top 50 hobbyist podcasts in Hungary. Love you in Hungary. So I know people download this, but for some reason, it doesn't actually. I don't know I'm getting reviews. So if you're listening to this, send me a review. But all right, I'm going to log off. Everybody have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Game on. And hopefully tomorrow for those who come in the streams. But if not, sometime later, I will talk to you. Cheers, everybody.